Hi, you're in class with Dr. T. Today I will be discussing the complicated and radical visions of white abolitionists, from slavery to structural racism. While African Americans have been the primary leaders in the fight against slavery and systematic racism, white abolitionists, often radical in their vision and actions, have played a significant supporting role, from John Brown's violent insurrection against slavery to contemporary white allies working to dismantle structural racism. These individuals have contributed to the broader struggle for racial justice, and without these allies realizing the importance of a broader human rights struggle for all, the struggle would not be possible, particularly in the USA, where the country remains majority of European ancestry. This essay explores 10 white abolitionists who over the centuries have fought alongside African Americans in the abolitionist and racial justice movements. Their commitment to radical change, often in opposition to the societal norms of their time, provides a historical framework for understanding the ongoing battle against racism. John Brown remains one of the most radical and controversial figures in the fight against slavery. A fervent abolitionist, Brown believed that slavery could only be eradicated through violent insurrection. His raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859 was an attempt to initiate a slave rebellion that would lead to the overthrow of the institution of slavery in the United States. While the raid ultimately failed and Brown was executed for treason, his action sent shockwaves through the country and galvanized the abolitionist movement. Brown's willingness to die for the cause of Black liberation made him a martyr for many in the movement. William Lloyd Garrison was a prominent white abolitionist whose newspaper, The Liberator, became one of the most influential platforms for the anti-slavery movement. Garrison was uncompromising in his stance on the immediate abolition of slavery, rejecting gradualist approaches and advocating for immediate emancipation without compensation to slaveholders. He also supported the rights of free African Americans and women's suffrage. Garrison's radical views, particularly his denunciation of the U.S. Constitution as a pro-slavery document, made him a controversial figure even among other abolitionists. Lydia Maria Child was a writer and activist who used her platform to advocate for the immediate abolition of slavery. Her 1833 book, An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans, argued against the institution of slavery on moral, political, and economic grounds. Child also worked with the American Anti-Slavery Society and advocated for Native American rights and women's equality. Her intersectional approach to abolition and human rights made her a critical figure in the broader fight against oppression in the 19th century. Theodore Dwight Well was a white abolitionist who helped to shape the moral and intellectual arguments against slavery. His book, American Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses, in 1839, co-authored with his wife, Angelina Grimke, and her sister, Sarah Grimke, compiled first-hand accounts of the brutalities of slavery. This text would go on to influence Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Weld was also instrumental in organizing the American Anti-Slavery Society, and his lectures and writings helped to spread abolitionist sentiment in the northern United States. Sisters Angelina and Sarah Grimke were born into a wealthy slave-owning family in South Carolina, but rejected their backgrounds and became staunch abolitionists. The Grimkes are notable not only for their abolitionist efforts, but also for their advocacy for women's rights. Angelina's 1836 pamphlet, An Appeal to the Christian Women of the South, urged Southern women to speak out against slavery, while Sarah's letters on the equality of the sexes linked the abolitionist movement to the early women's rights movement. Their intersectional approach laid important groundwork for future social justice movements. Charles Sumner was a leading white abolitionist senator from Massachusetts and a powerful orator against slavery in the U.S. Senate. His 1856 speech, The Crime Against Kansas, denounced the spread of slavery into the Kansas Territory. This speech provoked a violent response from pro-slavery forces, culminating in Sumner being brutally attacked by South Carolina's Congressman Preston Brooks on the Senate floor. Sumner's advocacy for abolition and civil rights for African Americans extended into Reconstruction, where he pushed for racial equality and the protection of freedmen's rights. Thaddeus Stevens was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives and one of the most prominent radical Republicans during the Civil War and Reconstruction era. Stevenson was a fierce advocate for the abolition of slavery and later for full civil rights for African Americans, including land distribution through the confiscation of former Confederate estates. He was instrumental in drafting and passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which collectively abolished slavery, granted citizenship to African Americans, and protected their voting rights. Anne Braden was a white civil rights activist who worked tirelessly to dismantle structural racism in the United States. Based in Kentucky, Braden became a central figure in the Southern civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. She and her husband, Carl Braden, were arrested for purchasing a home on behalf of an African-American family in an all-white neighborhood, an act of defiance against housing segregation. Throughout her life, Braden remained committed to fighting racism, advocating for desegregation, labor rights, and economic justice. Tim Wise is a contemporary white anti-racist educator, writer, and activist who has written extensively on white privilege and structural racism. His work emphasizes the need for white Americans to confront and dismantle the privileges they inherited from centuries of racial oppression. Wise's books, including White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son, have become influential texts in anti-racist education, and he frequently lectures on the intersections of race, class, and social justice. Jane Elliott is an educator and anti-racism activist, best known for her Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes exercise, which she first conducted with her elementary school students in 1968, following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. The exercise divided students based on their eye color and subjected them to discriminatory treatment to simulate the experience of racism. Elliott's work has continued into the present day as she lectures widely on racism, privilege, and the need for systematic change. Her emphasis on experiential learning has made her a controversial yet powerful figure in the fight against racism. In conclusion, while African Americans have been the primary leaders in the abolitionist and anti-racist movements, white abolitionists from John Brown to Jane Elliott have played important, if complicated, roles in the fight against both slavery and structural racism. These 10 individuals represent a spectrum of radical commitment, from violent insurrection to educational advocacy. Their contributions highlight the importance of solidarity across racial lines in the ongoing struggle for justice, even as their methods and visions have sometimes sparked controversy. Thank you. Please like, please share, and please subscribe.